The grand lecture hall of Lone Star University pulsed with anticipation as students and scholars gathered under towering archways and rows of gleaming lights. Among them slipped a quiet figure unnoticed by most. Emily Carter, in her modest gray cardigan and worn sneakers, chose an empty seat in the back row. The heavy weight of expectation did not fall on her shoulders. She wasn't a professor nor a graduate student. She was a custodian who loved numbers. As the elite filed in, unaware, Emily opened her tattered notebook, her heart racing. What began as an ordinary afternoon would soon rewrite expectations. Emily sat still, her fingers brushing the frayed edges of her notebook as the hall filled. At 36, she stood apart from the polished young scholars around her. Life had charted a different course for her. Early motherhood, long nights, cleaning empty academic buildings, and solitary hours spent unraveling complex equations had shaped her path. Without formal degrees or accolades, mathematics had been her constant refuge, the silent companion that made sense when nothing else did. As the crowd settled and the lecture began, Emily's sharp eyes scanned every formula projected before them, her passion hidden behind humble determination. The commanding figure of Professor Charles Whitmore approached the podium with the practiced elegance of a man accustomed to admiration. His tailored navy suit and silver hair radiated authority. Conversations hushed as he tapped the microphone and launched into his presentation on parallax equations and their theoretical application in quantum encryption algorithms. The complex symbols scrolled across the screen in deliberate rhythm. Students leaned forward eagerly, pens poised. Emily remained quiet in the back, heart racing as the formulas unfolded into familiar territory. Her mind worked quickly. It wasn't arrogance that made her notice the flaw, just habit. She traced each line mentally, then froze at the fourth step. A subtle miscalculation, small but capable of invalidating the boundary conditions under extreme variables. The realization filled her with both excitement and dread. The moment for questions arrived and the hall remained silent. Emily felt an almost involuntary lift of her hand. The sea of faces turned. Disbelief flickered across Professor Whitmore's sharp features as he gestured coldly toward her. Her pulse thundered as she stood suddenly hyper-aware of every mocking whisper rippling through the rows. When asked to identify herself, her quiet response of facilities management spread quickly through the hall. Snickers followed as she cautiously pointed out the inconsistency in the variable transformation. Whitmore's expression hardened, his pride pricked. He dismissed her observation as irrelevant. Heat burned in Emily's cheeks as she sat back down, unaware that this public embarrassment was only the spark of what was to come. Professor Whitmore stood at the front of the hall, adjusting his tie with deliberate precision. His cool gaze swept the audience before settling back on Emily. A wry smile played at the corners of his mouth as he turned and scrawled a daunting equation across the massive chalkboard. The symbols and variables twisted and sprawled, forming an advanced multivariate calculus problem known to challenge even experienced mathematicians. The unspoken challenge lingered thick in the air. The crowd's attention shifted sharply to Emily, their collective anticipation bordering on pity. She hesitated. Every instinct screamed at her to fade back into obscurity, but something deeper anchored her to the spot. Years of being overlooked and underestimated pushed her forward. Emily rose from her seat and stepped down the long aisle. Each footfall echoed against polished wood floors as skeptical eyes followed her approach. Taking the chalk from Whitmore's outstretched hand, she faced the intimidating wall of symbols. The professor's voice, laced with mock encouragement, drifted faintly behind her. The subtle undercurrent of laughter returned. For a moment, Emily stared at the problem, nerves prickling. Then the familiar clarity of numbers and logic slowly overtook her fear. The patterns whispered their secrets as her trembling hand moved toward the board to begin. The lecture hall held its collective breath as Emily worked steadily through the intricate equation. The faint sound of chalk against slate punctuated the heavy silence. Step by step, her confidence grew as the problem unraveled beneath her hand. When she reached the final answer, she stepped back. Professor Whitmore narrowed his eyes, scrutinizing the work with rigid intensity. His initial smirk faltered. The solution was flawless. But his pride refused to yield. Without a word, he erased the board and began inscribing a far more complex equation, one far beyond the realm of classroom exercises. This problem belonged to cutting-edge research tangled with cryptographic theory and advanced quantum principles. The symbols formed a web of theoretical abstraction, uncharted territory for even seasoned academics. The air tightened. A silent, unspoken gauntlet had been thrown. Emily stood motionless for a heartbeat, staring at the new equation. The challenge had shifted from humiliation to professional test, and the room once again waited for her response. Emily stood frozen for a long moment, eyes scanning the tangled maze of unfamiliar symbols. Doubt pressed hard against her resolve. This was no textbook equation. It was an enigma born from experimental mathematics. Whispers rippled quietly through the audience as seconds stretched unbearably. Professor Whitmore hovered nearby, already reaching for the chalk, certain she would retreat. Then something shifted. Deep within the chaos, a familiar structure emerged. A faint memory stirred a journal article glimpsed months earlier during a stolen lunch break. Patterns clicked into place like tumblers in a lock. With steady breath, Emily raised the chalk and began. Her strokes were slow at first, deliberate and cautious. Lines connected variables transformed under her hand. The whispers faded as the impossible began to take shape. Professors leaned forward. Students stared, their skepticism melting into fascination. Even Dr. Reyes, seated near the front, sat forward in disbelief. Midway through the equation, Emily paused. A dead end loomed. Pressure mounted. Professor Whitmore shifted, certain of her failure. But Emily stared harder, instincts searching the problem's depths. In a flash of clarity, she introduced a radical substitution, collapsing a complex step into an elegant simplification. Gasps echoed across the silent room as the breakthrough unfolded. The hall seemed to vanish as Emily stared at the partially complete equation. Her mind raced between competing impulses. Years of invisibility and survival had taught her to retreat to avoid standing out. Safety waited if she stepped away, slipping back into anonymity. Yet something stronger pushed back the relentless call of understanding, the quiet defiance forged through nights of silent study and sacrifice. She thought of Sophie, her daughter, whose own dreams rested on unshaken courage. The weight of the moment pressed heavily, yet her resolve solidified. With calm determination, Emily lifted the chalk once more and returned to the board. The silence in the lecture hall deepened to stillness as Emily re-entered her world of logic and numbers. The complex symbols no longer intimidated. They unfolded before her in graceful sequence. Her hand moved with measured confidence, weaving together transformations and substitutions that others had not yet imagined. The tangled problem slowly unraveled, yielding to clarity. As she neared the final steps, Emily encountered a particularly dense cluster of variables. She paused, tilted her head, then introduced a bold dimensional analysis that reduced the complexity with breathtaking efficiency. Dr. Reyes audibly gasped, drawing glances from her colleagues. The equation, once a formidable barrier, fell into harmony under Emily's touch. When the last value was boxed neatly on the board, she stepped back, breathing deeply. The hall remained frozen. The solution shimmered like an undeniable truth. Not only had she solved it, she had improved it. For the first time, the room acknowledged her brilliance in stunned silence. The lecture hall slowly stirred back to life. Professors whispered urgently among themselves. Students sat in stunned reverence. Dr. Reyes approached the board, tracing Emily's steps with growing awe. Cameras discreetly captured the impossible work. Professor Whitmore stood rigid, torn between lingering pride and the undeniable mastery before him. Emily stood apart, chalk dust clinging to her fingers detached from the flurry she had ignited. Dr. Reyes turned to her with newfound purpose, recognizing a mind that defied credentials. Across the room, eyes once filled with skepticism now held only respect. The barriers Emily had carried for years had quietly fallen. 6 months later, a smaller classroom buzzed with energy as undergraduates watched intently. Emily Carter stood confidently at the whiteboard, sleeves of her familiar gray cardigan pushed up as she guided them through a challenging theorem. The transformation had been swift and extraordinary. Dr. Reyes had secured an emergency fellowship, and Emily's innovative approaches had already appeared in major journals. Even Professor Whitmore, though reluctant at first, had eventually acknowledged her remarkable contributions. Yet the most profound change was within Emily herself. No longer shrinking into the shadows, she claimed her space and spoke with clarity and conviction. Her presence radiated quiet strength, the weight of years of self-doubt finally lifted. In the front row, Sophie watched with pride, inspired to follow her own path fearlessly. As a student raised a tentative hand, Emily smiled warmly and welcomed the question, remembering the moment she had once stood unsure. The cycle of courage had begun anew.